This will be a movie review of the 1946 movie entitled The Big Clock. It was produced by Richard Maybaum and directed by John Farrow. The movie stars, among others, are Ray Milland as George Stroud and Charles Laughton as Earl Janeth, who is the owner of a large New York publishing conglomerate. The movie is based on a novel written by Kenneth Fearing, who had another bestseller in 1939 entitled The Hospital. Paramount bought the rights to The Big Clock to produce this psychological film noir. I chose to review this movie and will be reviewing the movie entitled No Way Out shortly because they are both based on the underlying novel, The Big Clock. Each story follows the basic storyline. However, I believe writers can learn so much by seeing how the screenwriters change the underlying story enough to create two different stories from the same premise. So this is the first of two movie reviews. This review will not have any spoilers so as not to ruin the movie for anyone who hasn't seen it. It is a psychological thriller that moves fast and it's well worth watching. However, I will do a complete analysis with spoilers as part of the larger project comparing the two movie plots and how the writers were able to change the plot lines like I was just talking about. And I will post those links as they become available down in the description box for any writers or anyone else who wants to watch it. Now, before I begin the review, I want to mention something so anyone who is under 40 can understand a little bit about the actual building and its clock. The building is a large high-rise with a big clock that can be seen from the outside. Now, this was a big to-do back in 1946, but there's little mention of the clock itself. But it does play a small role in the movie. So I wanted to mention this for anyone who is too young to remember how big building clocks or digital clocks were considered at the cutting edge of technology. This is not explained in any detail in the movie, and I just wanted to cover it before I begin the review because tourists are mentioned later on in the story. And without knowing what a big deal this building with the clock was, you may not understand that one reason some of the tourists were there was because of the big clock. With that out of the way, I'll begin. The movie opens with a flash forward where the viewer sees George Stroud, the main character, frantically running around the building, upstairs in the clock area, wondering out loud how he got himself into this mess. The viewer is given a glimpse of what is to come. And for writers, this is the story hook. In the next scene, the movie begins in real time and we are introduced to Janeth Publications, a large, busy company that produces magazines, one of which is called Crime Ways. George Stroud, who is played by Ray Milland, is the editor-in-chief of Crime Ways magazine. He and his staff are all bustling about in the office, trying to get the magazine ready for release. George is rushing to get everything done, in particular because he is leaving at the end of the day for a week's vacation to go on a honeymoon with his wife and his son. Apparently, he had to cancel his first honeymoon due to a work emergency. But this week, he is planning to make it up to his wife. He's excited and looking forward to going. In the next scene, we see a beautiful, smartly dressed blonde woman who is looking through items on the big boss's desk. And she's listening to the conversation going on in George's office through an intercom that Earl Janeth, the big boss, uses to listen in on his employees. She listens in as George is telling Steve Hagen, Janeth's right-hand man, that he can't cancel his honeymoon again, and he goes on into a whole tale of woe about having been called away on an emergency on his first honeymoon and how mad and disappointed his wife is. He's trying to get Hagen to see things from his wife's perspective. And this is what the woman is listening to in the other office. Then the big boss, Earl Janeth, played by Charles Laughton, comes into his office and he sees this woman, who we find out is his mistress, Pauline York, who has managed to get through security and get into his office. She came up on his private elevator and flirted her way past security. Janeth is not happy, and he walks her out of the public elevators, and he tells her he will see her tonight at 10:50. You can see that there's tension between them, but the viewer gets to know he pays her bills, including her singing lessons. This confirms that she's the mistress. Back in George's office, Hagen is telling him that he has to stay and finish one of their investigations, but George refuses, and he finally storms out of the office. Hagen has not been able to get him to agree to cancel his honeymoon, and Janeth, the big boss, is not happy about it. So Janeth secretly plots another approach. In the next scene, George is sitting at the bar waiting for his wife. Pauline York, the mistress, sidles up to him and says she wants to tell his fortune. She then repeats everything she overheard him complaining about when she was eavesdropping from Janeth's office. She tells George that maybe they should put their heads together to get even with Janeth. But at that moment, Georgette, George's wife, strolls into the restaurant and is not happy about seeing her husband talking with this beautiful blonde. After a slightly tense moment between the women, Pauline leaves and George smooths down his wife's feathers by showing her he has reserved a table with champagne for them to toast the beginning of their honeymoon. His wife settles down, and she confirms she has the train tickets to West Virginia, where they will be going on the honeymoon. In the next scene, it's now after lunch, and George is again rushing to get everything done at work. At about 4 o'clock, Janeth strolls out of his office and over to George and joins him in front of his crime-solving blackboard. Janeth compliments George on always being able to solve crimes before the cops have to be called in. And George explains about his crime blackboard and how he always focuses on an irrelevant clue, and that always breaks the case. Janeth continues buttering George up, and he walks him casually into his office. He goes on and on about them being comrades in arms at work, etc. Then he tells George that he wants him to finish the Fleming case because that will increase their circulation by at least 10%. Then Janeth tells him he wants him to work on this nonstop for the next month. At this point, George realizes that his boss is telling him to cancel his vacation, but this time George protests and says he won't do it. After the buttering up of George hasn't worked, Janeth resorts to threats. He tells George if he doesn't stay and continue on the case, he'll lose his job, and Janeth will also blacklist him throughout the industry. He'll never work in this town again. George doesn't relent and storms out in anger. There is now an assumption that George has now walked out on his job. George goes into his office, and his secretary tells him a woman is on the phone and she wants to tell his fortune. George knows it's Pauline, and he picks up the call, and he blurts out that Janeth has just fired him. Pauline asks him what he's going to do, and he says right now he needs a drink. She wants to go with him, but he refuses at first. Then she says she may have a plan to get Janet to do what each of them wants. She tells him it will be worth his while to at least listen, and he agrees. She meets him at the bar, and after one too many drinks, George manages to get himself into trouble. But I won't go into any detail so as not to ruin the movie for anyone who hasn't seen it. Innocent things that took place when George and Pauline had a few drinks come back to haunt George in a way that he needs to resolve them on his own. So that's all I'll tell you, so as not to ruin the story for anyone. Now, what can a writer learn from this movie? This particular movie has everything. A writer can learn about subtly dropping clues along the way that seem unimportant but will be crucial at the end of the story. The clues are dripped slowly, with the heaviest clues being towards the end. I watched this movie twice and picked up different things each time because the action and clue dropping is nonstop. This movie can also teach writers about ratcheting up the stakes. At first, George's biggest problem is his wife's disappointment and the pressure she puts on him. Then his boss's demands add to his stress. Then George finds himself in a situation where he may be blamed for something he hasn't done. He then is selected to run the investigation where everyone is looking for him, but he's the only one who knows this. This movie also contains crucial dialogue that sets up and then plays out the psychological drama and power plays between Janet, George, and even Steve Hagen, the right-hand man. This dialogue shows a psychological cat and mouse game that is going on between these three characters and relies on dialogue and acting. There are also a few shocking developments the viewer doesn't see coming, so it's a great movie to watch and study how the writer hid what would happen until the moment it was sprung on the viewer. As a writer, you will be able to tell how this was orchestrated and then played out. This is also a story where a character gets trapped in a physical location. This premise alone requires him to try to escape, and there are multiple close calls, all of which build tension and suspense for the viewers. A writer can watch the close calls and learn a lot about writing these almost got caught scenes and how important the timing is. Analyzing these scenes in slow motion, so to speak, lets a writer see that it's more clever than hard. This is another movie that was made almost 80 years ago that has aged very well. Aside from the clock being no big deal by today's technology standards, the rest of the drama is based on human frailty, and that is ageless. So the premise, the mystery, the suspense, the clues, even the humor, they all still work. So now let's talk about who to watch in the movie. Ray Milland, he's great at being frantic, hitting all of his marks as he is trying to get himself out of one jam after another. One minute he's busy at work, then fighting with his boss, then trying to handle his long-suffering wife, and then he goes into a race around the building to hide and try to find evidence, all of which gets physical. He hits every mark, delivers all of his lines, some of which were part of this cat and mouse psychological game that goes on. So he gets A+ for his performance. The next one to watch is Charles Laughton. Now, he played the stingy, tyrannical boss, and he was great in it. He, too, acted with his emotions during the cat and mouse sequences, as well as other scenes that I won't reveal so as not to spoil anything, and he, too, gets an A+. The next person to watch is George McCready as he plays Steve Hagen, Janeth's right-hand man. He starts off playing kind of a low-key flunky type who is just always carrying out Janeth's orders. However, as the movie goes on, his role gets more and more significant. So he too gets A+ in his acting. Now, this movie also had a few quirky characters who were funny and added a little comic relief during the movie. I'm not going to mention who they are or what parts they play because that would kind of spoil it. One of them, though, I will tell you, was played by Laughton's wife, Elsa Lanchester, who is one of my favorite character actresses. And as usual, she was a riot. By watching these characters, it can teach us as writers about adding comic relief. Not only how to add it, but in what doses. In my opinion, they used it to perfection in this storyline. Now, I purchased this movie on YouTube to watch it, and it was $3.99. I planned to watch it more than once, which I wound up doing. But YouTube only gives you a 48-hour window in order to watch the movie. So I wound up having to pay twice because just based on my schedule, I didn't have enough time to watch it in the 48-hour window. But going forward, I believe Amazon Prime charges the same amount of money, and I don't think they're strict about their, how many hours they give you to watch it. I just mentioned that in case anybody is choosing between those two merchants. Anyway, they also have it on Google Play, which I know nothing about. I'm also going to leave the link to a website called justwatch.com because they keep track of where they have all of these movies, not old and new. So you can see where it's playing at the time you watch this video or at the time you want to watch The Big Clock. I hope you enjoyed this movie review. If you learned anything, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel because it really helps me. I will leave you with a panel of all of my novels and books that are available for purchase on Amazon. Some of them are in Kindle Unlimited. And I will see you in the next video.